everyone. Welcome to this webinar on geopolitical risk and portfolio decisions. I hope you're all as curious as I am to hear what our experts today have to say. We have with us today Marcus Ledberg, who is Chief Economist at Folksam. We have Christopher Dreiman, who is Chief Sustainability Officer at Länsförsäkringar, and Patricia Pina, who is Chief Research Officer at Clarity AI. A lot of chiefs with us. So I'm eager to start and dig into the topic straight away. And so in terms of geopolitical risks, we want to know first, just have a quick recap of what they are, where we are right now. I mean, there's a lot of words that we use. We use a lot of locations that sound very scary. There's Hormuz, there's Iran, there's Israel, there's AI, all of these scary terms. And we want to know, Marcus, what is really important? You've been in a special place in Brussels last week, and you found out what it's all about. So where did you go?
No. So I was at a research trip involving a visit to NATO headquarters, and of course that's a sign of the times, right? That investors go and see experts, not only there but also meeting more geopolitical experts, and I'm not sure we got the answers there, but that was part of the puzzle. So there's a lot of geopolitics, right? But not only that, it's also a lot of geoeconomics and political polarization and related issues. And so there seems to be a lot of things that's going wrong in the world. But if you want, one thing that doesn't go the wrong way is the stock market. S&P 500 is up almost 10% this year, and it's actually up quite a bit since the war started. And that may seem strange to a lot of people. That's not very different from previous geopolitical episodes. Asset prices don't tend to be long-term impacted by geopolitical events. Every time something happens, geopolitical things happens in the world, there's an broad assumption in society. This time is different. Now it's going to have a huge impact, and lo and behold, it doesn't. However, there is an important caveat to that old rule of thumb, and that is if the geopolitical event impacts commodities, then it may be different, right? Because then it will have some direct feed through to the economy through inflation. And obviously with Iran, and to some extent also with Venezuela, but that's much smaller, to take Iran, so 20% of world oil and world gas passes through the Strait of Hormuz, right? So that has an impact. And we have seen inflation moving up, and we have seen bond markets reacting to higher inflation. 10-year yields have moved higher almost everywhere. The market has repriced short-term interest rates move from having cuts to having rises later this year. So there has been a reaction, but we've seen it in the bond market rather than in the equity market. And just last point, so why is the equity market still holding up? Well, first, most importantly, corporate results have been really good. So still, stellar profits, especially in the US. Two, the world economy is still in a relatively good place, very different from when the war in Ukraine started. Then the world was, especially on the underlying inflationary pressure was much higher. Now it's lower, not the least in Sweden, where I'm calling in from. Third, equity market is calculating very hard on taco, that Trump will seek a solution. And again, we'll see where we're going to end up this week, but that's something the market is. And fourth point, which is perhaps the least well known, the oil, we can maybe come back to that. The oil market is more or less still in balance, which sounds weird because everyone assumes 20% of oil has taken off the market, but there has been strategic reserves have been used. Other, like the U.S. have increased their production. Even Russia sells more oil on the world market these days. So we don't really have this squeeze yet. But of course, this is artificial breathing. So sooner or later, it will be felt more strongly also, and probably in the equity market, unless the strait is reopened.
Right. And so now you've painted the picture at the macroeconomic level. And Christopher, you're responsible for the sustainability of the entire Länsförsäkringar. And what we're curious to know about today is, why did you go on the same trip as Marcus last week? What's in it for you to go talk to visit NATO?
So I think I was the only sustainability, at least dedicated sustainability person there. So maybe I'm being proactive or in the wrong place. The future will tell. But I think the stability and peace is obviously fundamental to the sustainability agenda. It's hard to move the needle in terms of climate change, tackling biodiversity loss, etc. If we don't have peace and stability around us. So I think that's the bottom line, that we need to work in parallel, both ensuring a safe and stable both jurisdiction where we can act and invest, but also on a more global scale, challenging in the current environment. So that was the underlying reason. We have almost exchanged the word ESG and sustainability to resilience, independence, sovereignty in the last couple of 12 to 24 months, especially after Trump got re-elected and entered the White House. So being part of these discussions that we had last week, both at NATO and the EU Commission, are core to also driving a progressive sustainability agenda. I would also like to add that the events both this year and the previous years have also sort of triggered a greater need to assess country risks more systematically, both for us as a firm and with a huge supplier base, thousands of suppliers, of which some are both located in the US and some in emerging markets, where these events have an impact also on our operations, as well as on the investment side, given that we have allocation to both DM and EM.
Right, and now we come to you, Patricia. You are chief of research, so you have the finger on the pulse when it comes to data. What is the data telling you about what investors are worried about, and also what that means in terms of investments and portfolio construction?
Yeah, so thank you so much. I'm very much aligned with my colleagues were mentioning. I think there are two main trends happening right now. So one is, and those are linked to this idea of global and stable markets. So on global, there is definitely a trend towards regionalization, and it is framed typically, and we hear, and I think Christopher mentioned, in terms of resilience, security. We have seen it with energy, with defense. I think we are going to see it, and we are starting to see it also with AI, the computing powers. So there is that trend in terms of regionalization, which means that it is more important to understand regional dynamics and companies' adaptability and those exposures. On the stability piece, I guess I will only mention one data point. The Geneva Academy of International Humanitarian Law and Human Rights is currently monitoring over 110 conflicts, and that's like national and also international conflict, and we have seen that unfolding. So I think those are some of the two key trends that investors are struggling with. I wanted to add specifically on kind of the defense part and some dynamics we are seeing, maybe Nordic countries versus the rest of Europe. I think like that investing or moving capital flows into domestic defense and building that that regional infrastructure in Europe. We are seeing it in all different countries. I think everywhere in Nordic countries used to be historically were pioneers in imposing strict exclusions on weapons and defense. And we are seeing that being relaxed, not only in Nordic countries, but across Europe. However, what is happening in many of the, and I'm noticing in many of the conversations I have, is that still there is high sensitivity in the Nordics for actually involvement in conflicts where human rights or ethical violations can be or are being questioned. And that comes from the broader civil society and kind of the beneficiaries. So while still investing in building the regional defense infrastructure, there remains a sensitivity towards involvement in conflict and potential human rights violations.
Well, that's interesting that you mention human rights, and that what I conclude is that investor scrutiny in general is increasing, especially in places like the Nordics. And so what I would like to hear is from you, Christopher. What do you think now about this debate about between engagement and exclusions? It's been an ongoing debate in Sweden in particular. There's been proponents for both sides. Some people try to reconcile both. But it seems like, given today's climate, this debate can be revisited. Perhaps is it harder to engage, or are we going to see more exclusions?
So to start, sort of engagement and exclusions are obviously two of the strategies in the responsible investment toolbox that are being utilized to a greater extent, partly due to the reasons Patricia mentioned, with the growing number of conflict and wars, both within countries and between countries. And we see it as well. We have both an exclusion list publicly available, as well as a focus list. The focus list is the companies we either have confirmation or suspect involvement in violation of, for example, human rights. And that list has grown in line with the developments we've seen in the last couple of years, with an increasing amount of conflicts around the world. So that means that we need to pay more attention and dedicate more time to conducting research, because of all the sort of exclusion and engagement criteria we have. Obviously, excluding a company with 5% of revenues from thermal coal is one thing, and you can be relatively objective in that assessment. But when it comes to norm violations, for example, linked to human rights, you need to both source much more data. We prefer this triangular approach where we have, one or several data providers pointing in the direction of, yes, this company is responsible, preferably that the company themselves declare that, yes, we have done something wrong and we will do this about it. And thirdly, NGO or other type of sort of state or municipality linked authorities that sort of pointing in a certain direction. But often that's not the case. We have one source telling that the company is involved, and then other sources telling something else. And then we need to spend both more human capacity on analyzing the research and the company, as well as sourcing more data from existing and potentially new providers. So given the developments, we need to spend more time, and then obviously also conclude that some companies are involved in, or suspiciously involved in violations. Now, that's the first step, and we prefer to engage before we exclude, because if we and Folksam and other sort of responsible investors leave the table, that doesn't necessarily mean that the company will be more responsible in the future. It's rather than we leave our voice around the table, and it will most likely be replaced by other investors that don't pay as much attention to the agenda as we do. So that's always a balance act, but we also obviously need to consider it in relation to the risks we see, both from a reputational point of view and also given that this is a discussion about allocation investment, the investment risk from these companies. So it was quite a long answer, but yes, more data and research is required. The number of cases we look at is growing due to the geopolitical conflicts around the world. And lastly, I just want to mention that we also have headwinds in the US, given the executive orders Trump has launched, both against companies, but also proxy voting providers when it comes to what kind of language, advice, etc. they can use. And that has made it more challenging to engage, especially with US-based companies. And you sort of need to invent a new language. Instead of talking about the climate change, you talk about climate opportunities. And instead of diversity, you need to change to another word that is sort of not in a blacklist of words you can't use in a context where we engage with investees. So that has also had an effect on engagement, especially with US company. And actually, when we look at the data, slowed the progress down when it comes to milestones we evaluate companies against, for example, climate change.
Right. So you mentioned this taboo vocabulary. We come to that in a little bit, but you also mentioned that the number of cases is growing, and it must be hard to prioritize because we don't have infinite resources, and therefore in a team, time is precious. And Patricia, you are providing the data potentially for this prioritization to happen. So how does it work in practice?
Yeah, definitely. And using the example, maybe, and Christopher was mentioning geopolitical conflicts and kind of these conflict areas, conflict affected and high risk areas. So there is the argument definitely about prioritizing for engagement. What Christopher was saying, engage before excluding, that's very relevant. I think in this context, there is also another argument that information tends to be limited and is a sensitive topic. So really understanding what is going on and starting that dialogue and that engagement it becomes even more relevant for this context because of that partial or asymmetry of information that might exist sometimes. However, as you are asking me, there is still like some information out there that can be used to prioritize and is very useful. So how does it work? Basically, what Christopher was mentioning, understanding first which companies are exposed to those contexts, that's important. And when I mean exposed to those contexts, it might be because they are operating in a particular region that is affected by a conflict, or maybe because they have joint ventures with governments involved in conflict or suppliers. So there is a piece on understanding those exposures, and there is information available to know that. In addition to the exposure, typically, it is also important to understand the allegations, whether those companies have been accused of any potential wrongdoing in those contexts. And in there, it is about the nature of that wrongdoing, also the scale and the scope, and most important and very important, as Christopher was mentioning, the company's response. What has been the company's response to that allegation? And of course, the evidence that is behind those allegations, who is making that allegation, based on what information, when happened, what investigations were launched by whom. So those are the type of information that can be provided and are useful to actually prioritize and to understand where to start ranking those allegations and those cases. One thing that I also want to emphasize, because sometimes I hear clients or people asking me, investors asking me, the question about which company should I divest, should I exclude, that is a question that data can inform. What we are talking about, definitely this data can inform that discussion and that decision, but there are other considerations as the interpretation, the mandate that the company, the investor has, the interpretation of that mandate and the expectation of the beneficiaries. And those are discussions that need to happen in-house, and that's homework that they need to do themselves.
Right. And talking about homework, Marcus, at Folksam, you know how to do your homework, and you have prioritized, and you ended up prioritizing Tesla for some internal reasons. Can you explain how this came about?
Yeah. So nice bridge there. Yeah, we divested from Tesla last year throughout the group, but it was not because of Elon Musk or geopolitics or what's at least not directly. It was because the company was violating our principles regarding labor and union rights. And it was, and I think Christopher, mentioned, it's becoming also more difficult to engage with companies in the U.S. So it was a combination of those two things, and this is not exact science. But I do agree with Patricia. There are numbers and data we can use to inform our decisions, but exactly when do you take that step is a combination of factors, but it's based in our principles. We have principles for what we want companies to do and what companies not to do, and then we engage. We see it as a failure when we have to divest from companies, and it's not something we'd like to do. But at the end of the day, on occasion we do it because when we don't see there's a way forward, and I think Tesla was an example of that. It is also an example that matters a bit because it has a relatively large weight in the index. That's of course that doesn't matter for the principle, but let me if I may, let me make a larger point where I think all of us need to think a little bit. Exclusions used to be, I guess, more prevalent in emerging markets and in certain sectors. A lot of focus on the equity market. We could deal with that in the way that was described. Now, if we're having a situation where also countries in developed markets and countries are going against international law, and we're moving into new world order, which is less rules based and more based on the power of the strong. And you all know that what country I'm talking about, and it's the biggest the U.S. sovereign bond market is the biggest single market in the world. I'm not saying or advocating that we should exclude, U.S. sovereign bonds, but we need to think about it, how to treat it, and of course, that is given the role of the U.S. sovereign bond and other, sovereign bond markets in the world. How do you engage with the country, and especially when it's one of the largest countries in the world, right? How do we think about this? And there was a lot of, news or speculation coming out last year how investors are treating U.S. assets in U.S. based. And one thing is from a pure risk and return perspective that we know how to handle, but also from this perspective. And I believe there was one Danish pension fund that publicly said they had sold off, but I didn't see much more. And so I think we are also creeping slowly into a world, going back to your first question, which is more difficult, where we have to. I still think it's important to be principle based and follow your processes and so on and so forth. But But again, coming back to it, it's not exact science. It's not, you don't, have a number, or most investors don't have a number, or an aggregate. This is so it is difficult, and we have to appreciate that it's difficult, but we also have to appreciate that this is very important.
Right, and you're saying it's not an exact science, and I think the regulator buys that, and that's why the EU has come up with a bunch of requirements for transparency, so that investment professionals actually say what they do or do what they say. And Patricia, you with data have been able to help out investors who now have been strongly incentivized to be more transparent. So how in practice does your data help? And also, how do you make sure that your data is transparent enough for this to hold all the way through?
Yeah, and actually, I have been hearing that a lot lately, about I don't want to be accused of saying something and doing something else. So I think that's something on everyone's mind, and even more for asset owners, to be honest, that use external managers or pool vehicles, because then they have even less direct control on those investments. And that's when reporting both from managers to them and to them to beneficiaries becomes even more critical. And it is about building that trust and credibility and kind of transparency on what you are saying and what you are doing. So the way we have been and we have been always thinking about that question is making sure that there is full traceability on the data that you are using to inform your decisions. And when I mean full traceability, I don't only mean like raw data, kind of the input data, but also if that data is processed, is transformed, is used for other for modeling as an input for certain kind of models. Also being able to explain the assumptions, the limitations, even the confidence level of those predictions or more complex analytics you are providing. That's also very important, because you need to understand those in order to kind of make meaningful use of the data to inform decisions, and then being able to explain that full change and that full logic and rationale behind that. And I think one thing I wanted to add, because we've been talking about AI at the beginning and you mentioned AI a few times. So I do think AI is helping all of us improve efficiency, productivity. I'm sure we all are experiencing it, and that's great. And even more in this type of context where reporting can be time consuming and labor intensive, and you want definitely to streamline that. However, AI also come with risks, and there is a transparency aspect to also AI that I think is very important. And I think even more when AI is used for predictions or recommendations, really understanding where and how AI is being used, I think is critical. And not only that, also understanding which controls are in place to mitigate the risk that comes with them. Like what type of human oversight you have, all that mechanisms, how are you controlling for potential biases or hallucinations. So those are newer transparency requirements that are starting to emerge because AI is being integrated in many workflows across the financial industry. But I think that's as critical, if no more, than the traditional transparency requirements we are all used to think and discuss about.
I have a follow-up question for you, Patricia, but before I ask it, I just want to tell everyone you're probably sitting on your hands, having lots of questions. If you have one that you really can't help but ask, then just put it in the chat, and I'll pick it up on the way. So just Patricia, on the topic of AI, I was just curious to know if you could give us an idea of how much the accuracy and your ability to be transparent and to streamline the process, especially for this regulatory reporting, has improved in the past 12 months. Because we all know that the curve in AI is very, very steep. And of course, you're specialists in harnessing that power and that speed. How much better has it become?
So definitely, so first the AI models, like every single new models that is being released to the market is incredible. It's an exponential curve that has been definitely increasing a lot. In terms of like our productivity, and we have been using AI like for many years before. And I guess I always say we are called Clarity AI, but we were called Clarity AI in 2017. So this was before ChatGPT and all these things. So definitely generative AI has taken it to the next level, but AI existed before and it was being leveraged in different workflows before that. Generative AI has taken it to the next level and has given us kind of a discrete jump into that productivity. So definitely in extraction, like data extraction has been really powerful. In data quality, finding patterns is very, very powerful. And then in actually report generation, and I think it's where it can be most useful, actually getting the inputs and created those reporting. That's where you can save a lot of time and creating those standard templates. However, I would say that also, while I'm super excited about AI because kind of is in our DNA, I would also say that I like every day whenever I interact with AI, I always have this feeling AI tells me what he thinks or she thinks I want to hear about. And then I need to challenge and I tell the opposite. I've been told that this is not correct. And oh, you are right. Actually, this is a good observation. So it's great. It's helping us a lot. Let's all be careful because it still has uh, limitation, risk, and concerns that we all need to be aware of.
Yeah, AI is definitely clever enough to know how to flatter our egos, so we believe it. So Marcus, at Folksam, how do you ensure that you can provide transparency to all your constituents, and both internally and externally? And in that context, how much do you use AI?
Yeah, it's a good question. Yeah, no, so obviously, at a minimum, we obviously do all the things that are regulatory, mandatory, which is an increasing workload, right? Annual reports, sustainability reports, but also, especially within the EU context, a lot of reporting. So whoever, whatever stakeholder it is, you'd always be able to find that very easily. But then we also try to reach out to our stakeholders and clients, most importantly, through media, through participating in the in the public discussion about things, and sometimes that also involves trying not necessarily to challenge existing views, but provide nuances and perhaps problematize a little bit, and that could be both in the insurance business and in the pension savings. But then I particularly find it very important to be to communicate with your stakeholders during periods of volatility and stress. I mean, like the period we're having now, or we've been having the last couple of, even if stock markets are going up, you can see your return. Oh, my pension is growing, and so on. So, but that we have our vision is our clients should feel safe in a sustainable world, and of course that is a vision. And one could argue that's not where we are right now. So we have to communicate. What can we do to move in that direction of our vision, and be out there communicating. And I think, you know, different clients, different stakeholders need a different kind of communication. Not everyone downloads the annual report or the annual sustainability report and read it from cover to cover. Maybe very few clients do that, right? So then we have to communicate that different, trying to be proactive. In terms of AI, I think, you know, we do use AI. We have a couple of AI agents, especially, you know, on the insurance side, communicating with clients in different ways. We are broadly encouraged to use it, but again, you know, still there's a balancing act respecting, you know, data and privacy, because we sit on a lot of sensitive data and so on. So that's obviously. Personally, I am super excited. I have employed a couple of AI agents in the macro bureau, and you know, they are incredible. I am, you know, I just, you know, it's like being a kid again. I can play around with it, and you know, what it can do is it even, you know, this is a little bit beside the point, but it even writes beautifully. It's not clunky. It's, you know, it writes quite beautifully. So yeah, no, there, I think, you know, we will explore in the next couple of years exactly what it can do to productivity, and but also, you know, from security point of view, this is very important. Also from a labor market point of view, this is probably why I spend most of my time trying to understand what implication it will have to the labor market. I know this is a bit besides the point, but I couldn't help myself.
Well, let's see if we have time to come back to it later on. Always an interesting point. And so before we move on to the wider implications, Christopher, Länsförsäkringar has this, I mean, both Länsförsäkringar and Folksam are the biggest insurance companies in Sweden, but you have quite a different structure. You have to make sure that transparency is spread throughout the organization, which is quite complex. So what are the challenges that you face, and how is AI helping you?
Yeah, so we're a federation with 23 regional insurance companies across Sweden, and a couple of decades ago, they also choose to establish the sort of service and development company, Länsförsäkringar AB, where I'm employed. And given our size, and also what we used to refer to sort of financial warehouse with offerings from, you know, anything to animal insurance, life and non-life insurance, pension, bank, and even a real estate agent, we're affected by most of the regulation coming out of the EU, and even with the omnibus. But the difference is that depending on the size of the company I'm employed by, or one of the regional insurance companies, the size obviously matters when it comes to which regulation they're affected by. And here we see huge potential already with utilizing AI tools, both on the investment side, but also, as Marcus referred to, when it comes to producing everything from annual and sustainability reports, SFTR documentation, taxonomy related documentation, etc. So we already leverage it, but the potential is much more greater than we have, I think, used so far. The thing I would like to stress is that the problem is not necessarily that we, you know, have a sustainability report of, I think, 70 pages for 2025, and it was 90 pages 2024. As you said, Marcus, no one reads it. It's too static, given the pace of change in both our local society and the globe and the global economy as a whole. So we therefore need to communicate through other channels and at a different pace, because that's what stakeholders expect from us, both internally and externally. And here it's also helpful to have both obviously a bunch of commercial, non-commercial providers of ESG data, but you can also utilize AI to rather quickly come up with at least a point of view on the current developments, whether it's Iran, US, or wherever it might be, or for that matter, a specific company. So we need to be more agile when it comes to communicating with different stakeholders.
Right. So promising progress with AI, and of course challenges to be addressed in terms of maintaining transparency. But now we're coming to the most practical and most crucial part of our discussion today, which is how do you integrate geopolitical signals into long-term strategy? And of course, we'd like to hear from you, Marcus, first, since that is your day-to-day work, where you're playing with your AI friend and trying to design what's going to happen and then make it more concrete and help everyone make more money.
Yeah, because that's what, at the end of the day, right? That's what we're supposed to do. No, but so we're quite comfortable with our long-term focus and really trust our convictions. I often, liken our portfolio management as an ocean liner, right? We don't, change, because the wind is changing a little bit. We stay the course, but then we fine tune and we adjust a little bit. And I think, one of those things have been, this year has been the one I mentioned in the beginning with geopolitics and asset prices. We haven't changed our portfolio that much. We have a robust underlying portfolio that should be able to manage different kinds of climates and winds and market circumstances. So we're quite comfortable with that. Even when you see big headlines in the newspapers, you even see some public institutions out there talking and but our job, we come back to our job is to manage long-term assets. But it's not, and this is where it becomes both interesting and difficult. It's not that we completely ignore geopolitics or political developments, but if I've used one phrase a lot lately to our stakeholders, is that just as one should not overestimate the economic and financial consequences of geopolitics in the short run, one should not underestimate the consequences in the longer term, right? And one example, then going back to the examples I made with sovereign risk, sovereign bond risk. We're moving towards something that's less rules based. How should we take that into consideration when we're doing long-term asset allocation, strategic asset allocation? That's something we're spending a lot of time. What is country risk? Is it the same as it used to be? What is, another one? I saw there was a big article in Financial Times today. What is, how does this impact, correlations in between asset classes? Do we need to rethink, the basis that goes into our asset allocation? So, no, and this is, I mean, this is really difficult, but again, also very important. But we don't want to make any rash, quick decisions. We really want to think this through and discuss it internally and also with peers like yourselves.
And just to situate the debate here, I mean, there's been a big debate in Sweden in particular, but I would say in Northern Europe in general about defense investments, right? And and you mentioned earlier that you excluded Tesla on the grounds of labor rights because that's a value that was important to you. Is defense something that is important to Folksam, and to what extent has it affected your decisions or your exclusion list?
Yeah, so not much. We've most of the companies have been able to invest in defense all along, but with restrictions on what kind of defense. One of the companies made adjustments to their policy, so it's more now aligned with the others that can invest in defense, but and that may have some implications on the assets they hold, but I hear, and I hear the public discussion and pension investors should buy more defense and so on and so forth. And sure. But then again, the biggest exposure, I mean, I think certainly for a lot of investors is through sovereign bonds, right? Most defense is financed through the budget. European governments are not promising to increase defense spending to 5% of GDP. That's material. So how is that going to be? Well, they're going to issue more bonds, and we buy the bonds, right? All of us, we're the biggest buyer of sovereign bonds. Not we, but the industry is the biggest buyer of sovereign bonds throughout Europe, and that is. So there's a lot of focus on the listed companies on the stock market. They tend to be quite few in Europe, so it's not that much you can buy. And then the hope is that it's going to be, more venture capital and private equity and so on and so forth. But that the size of that market is pretty small. So it's through the sovereign bond, and that's pretty undramatic, right, in Europe, because we used to buy the sovereign bonds, we still buy the sovereign bonds. If there's more issuance, well, I think, and so I there's a lot of hype about that, but I find it not that dramatic.
And at Länsförsäkring, Christopher, you said that you had a complex structure. Are you able to have a unified opinion when it comes to these complicated questions, such as defense? Are you even talking about sovereign bond exposure?
Well, we do talk about sovereign bond exposure, but interesting, maybe a side point in that debate is that roughly, 8 to 9 years ago, we decided to sort of gradually shift our allocation to sovereign bonds, as Marcus said, mainly due to solvency rules from the EU, to other types of issuers under the SSA umbrella, meaning in addition to sovereigns, also supranationals and an agency. And that decision was driven by a will to increase the allocation to what then was referred to as green bonds. Now it's more like an umbrella term, sustainability bonds. It could be green, social, or thematic. So we already made a shift away from sovereign bonds into more supras and agencies, starting roughly 8 or 9 years ago. So at least on the life and non-life insurance portfolios, I don't think we have any pure sovereign exposure at the moment, but that might change tomorrow. But at least I think we have at least made a firm decision many years ago to shift away from these type of assets in order to increase the allocation to sustainable bonds. But that was a side note. The oldest sort of ESG-related exclusion criteria we have, both for our portfolios and funds, were introduced in 2014, and those were based to normalization and controversial weapons. Controversial weapons being both biological and chemical cluster and anti-personnel landmines, and also with a Nordic touch, nuclear weapons. And given the developments during the last couple of years, not just the war in Ukraine, but also Sweden's membership in NATO, a different sort of tone from the US administration that Europe should take a great responsibility for its own security and defense. And then also from the current Swedish government, a lot of budget proposals and investments to strengthen the so-called total defense line with NATO's 5% objective. That triggered a review within LF. It was also triggered by individual clients asking for different types of fund products where a great extent is being allocated to companies either involved in the military industry or also the civil defense, like cyber, etc. So that triggered a review, a 9-month discussion within the federation, and we then concluded in December that we should adjust some of our exclusion criteria linked to nuclear weapons and allow companies domiciled in NATO or EU that have a limited role in the US, France, and UK nuclear weapon program. And with limited, I mean that we introduced a 5% revenue threshold. And that basically opened up roughly, to reference MSCI ACWI, roughly, I think, 0.8 or 1% of the investable universe compared to how it was previously. But again, as Marcus said, that's just a secondary market. The big shift can happen when it comes to allocating assets to the SSA sort of community, and that's why we'll also initiate a dialogue with the current government's whatever that word is in English, but she's like the national investigator for strengthened private-public partnership for the total defense industry. So we try to engage on multiple levels in order to support, and also when needed and where it meets our risk-adjusted return objectives, allocate depending on asset class.
That seems like a very pragmatic approach. And talking about pragmatic approaches, Patricia, your data allows to make some of these assessments also beyond the defense industry. And one of the questions that you might have been exploring is how to translate the geopolitical risk we've been talking about at the corporate level in terms of data, because now we know, SSA, corporate bonds, they all have different types of exposures in terms of geopolitical risks. I mean, not everyone has the possibility to have such a broad view of the entire portfolio. If you're focusing more on the equity side, it's going to be important for you to have the data to decide how the country risk is going to affect the companies. Is this something that you've been exploring, and what have been the results so far?
Yeah. So first, and we were mentioning this, so when we are talking about geopolitical risk, going back to the beginning, we are talking about systemic political, economic, and social conditions. And then this translation is about how those conditions affect individual businesses and financial markets. So that's what we need to do. And I'm going to say the obvious. I mean, you kind of already say it. I think the starting point is understanding what you own, what you actually have in your portfolio, and the relevant questions, some of the questions that you need to be asking yourself are related to, for example, the supplier distribution by region, the revenue breakdown, the headcount and asset allocation. So a lot of the questions that are relevant for this type of risk are linked to that geographical footprint at different levels. And I think what we really want to do and where we are heading towards in the future is real-time monitoring and identification of relevant geopolitical events. So for example, like new export controls on chips or whatever new, and then like immediately mapping those relevant events to the companies, to kind of what we are saying, to how those could be affected through their revenues, their operations, their supply chains, their contracts, their counterparts, so that we can surface this. And we are not there yet, but actually I think AI, and we mentioned AI before, is going to help us get there. Because what you need to do is, first, of course, you need kind of knowledge graphs or relationships at the company level that map all these different variables and factors that I am talking about. So you can build those graphs. Then you need kind of an ontology layer that talks about geopolitical risk factors, what is kind of the relationships and the semantics and the relevant construct and concept on that level. And then the LLMs, the AI, that actually uses those two layers to be able to reason and to provide insight here. So I think that's where we are heading towards. And of course, you also need a control layer. I mentioned before, you need to kind of have controls to ensure that your outputs are robust and explainable, in addition to fair and secure. But I think that's where we are heading towards, linking the events to the company's implication at those different levels and doing that in a more real-time manner.
I think we've had quite a good overview of the topic today. We've identified the problem, of probably recap the problem, so everyone knows where the risks are and where they might be focusing in the future. We've looked at exclusions and engagement. Unfortunately, coming to the conclusion that there might be more exclusions coming up, and that it will be increasingly hard for investors to focus their attention. But AI and data are there to help out, and they are also helping out for reporting purposes and transparency. And to finish, we've looked at the importance of looking at the long term and not being too distracted by these short-term signals, and not to panic, especially when you're in charge of a very large portfolio of one of the largest insurance companies in Sweden. Do you have one last word of wisdom for the webinar today, Marcus?
Oh, I was just hoping you would ask some of the others first. I had 30 seconds to think, but no. No, I'll just say something that I actually think we didn't really talk about it, but it could actually be a link between geopolitics, this new world order, and and it's close to me because I'm covering macro, but that's inflation, right? Inflation is I mean, it doesn't care about who's in charge or what regime we are in. If we're having inflation, or what politicians tell you, or what asset owners are telling you, if you have inflation, you have inflation, right? And that will drive things. And when in doubt, always listen to the bond market, because it is the biggest and it's the scariest. So if you don't know where we're heading, look at the bond market.
All right, that was quite ominous, but very practical. Christopher, what is your word of wisdom?
Yeah, even Trump seems to care about the bond market.
There you go.
As did Theresa May back in the days. I think we touched upon engagement with companies, and we're used to doing that, for decades now. But given the developments in the world, I think we as investment professionals need to also broaden the scope of different stakeholders in our value chain beyond just corporates to engage with, and we have touched upon it indirectly, but I think we need to also think about how we can engage with representatives of countries, basically, in order to address some of the rising risks we see.
Thank you. And the last word is for you, Patricia.
Okay. So I guess I'm going back to kind of my data lens. So start with the decision, what decision you are trying to make, understand that, and then what data can help you and you need. So start by the end and then figure out the data that you need, rather than starting with the data.
Very pragmatic. Thank you. So this was a webinar proposed by Nordsip in partnership with Clarity AI. Marcus Wedberg, Christopher Dreiman, and Patricia Pina, thank you so much for joining us today. And thank you everyone else for attending.
Thanks, Helene.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.